Welcome to Globe Watch with me, Charles Ebune. The Lake Chad equals the U.S. state of Maryland, but had the size more than the state of Kuwait or the state of Israel. Between 1963 and 2003, the lake shrank from 25,000 kilometers square to 1,500 kilometers square. That is according to An Inconvenient Truth, a book published by former U.S. Vice President Al Gore. Today, communities across the world and Africa are complaining about climate change, and the Lake Chad Basin is just an example. My guest today has been working on environmental issues for the past 2 years. He works with the United Nations Environment Program headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. What should Africa do in order to remain sustainable in a world where climate change and environmental problems are a cause for concern? Dr. Richard Munang, welcome to Globe Watch.
Thank you.
Statistics from American scientists claim that last year, 2014, was the warmest at the United Nations Environment Program. Is that a worrying affair?
Absolutely, it is. And that brings us to the point of saying that climate change is no longer an abstract issue. It is happening, and we are already feeling the impacts today. The Lake Chad that is shrinking, as compared to 1973, is shrink more than the size of an entire country. And as a result of this, if you look at the livelihoods that are dependent on this, it's a signal that we can no longer do business as usual. And at the same time, the livelihoods of the millions of people who depend on this, whether it's Cameroon, whether it's Chad, whether it's Nigeria, means that we have to put measures in place to be able to reverse this changing climate, which is already affecting millions of people in the continent. And just to put some statistics, last year the United Nations Environment Program published what they call the First Africa Adaptation Gap Report. And what this report actually showed was the ecological degradation happening at a rate that is unprecedented, and at the same time, with already changing climate, the continent needs to put in place 7 to 15 billion to be able to build the adaptive capacity of the entire continent. And if we don't limit the emissions in the atmosphere today to 2 degrees, we will be spending up to about 350 billion if we reach 4 degrees. But if we reach only 2 degrees, the continent by 2050, which is less than 35 years from today, will spend 35 billion. And if we go up to 2070, we will spend about 200 billion. This money needs to be put in place, and at the same time, the developing countries that have been part of the increasing emissions have got to be able to cut the emissions so that the world can be able to progress along a sustainable pathway.
You just talked of measures. We know that by December there will be a global summit in Paris, COP21, one of those meetings again to discuss about keeping the temperatures at 2%, because the last intergovernmental panel on climate change backed by the United Nations said that if we don't arrive at such a conclusion, it will be a catastrophe. What should leaders particularly do in Paris by December?
There is no other option apart from the world coming together to foster a binding agreement where every nation can be able to play its part, whether it is least developing, whether it is developing, and whether it is a developed world. Because the atmospheric space that is being shared by every citizen in the world today is not going to have any alternative in terms of the impacts. United States will suffer, Europe will suffer, Africa will suffer. So from the perspective of what needs to be done, every leader, every citizen have got to look at the issue of climate change as one of the fundamental issues that is facing humankind today. And therefore, fostering a legal binding agreement is the only way forward, because if we don't, the catastrophic impacts will be unbearable on each and every one.
Surely they will be unbearable in the economic area, as you outlined the amount of money we need to spend to adapt. How will this affect Africa's development strides in particular?
This is an excellent question.
Because everybody will say the continent of poverty.
Excellent question. As we speak today, Africa is being classified under the cliche as Africa rising. But at the same time, the issue of climate change has not been detailedly factored in. And therefore, the question should be, with Africa rising, is it sustainable? Or is this just a kind of a euphoric metaphor that will not last for a long time? But as the statistics have shown us, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, AR5, Assessment Report 5, which came out in November, showing that the African development gains are currently being reversed as a result of the changing climate. Sea level rise is predicted to be 10% higher than the global mean. And if you look at the African continent, there are more than 35 countries that share the coastline. And most of these countries have their economic engine, so to speak, in cities that are located closer to the coastline. And therefore, if there is sea level rise, the economic gains will be disrupted, maritime action will be disrupted, and therefore affecting the jobs that are being created and booming the economy of the continent. And the agricultural sector, which is actually the backbone of the economies of most African countries, employing 60% of the entire continent workforce, will be disrupted. And the report produced by the UN Environment Programme, the Africa Adaptation Gap report, has indicated, shows that if we reach 2 degrees, crop production, especially wheat, maize, sorghum, which are staple food that the continent depends on, will be reduced by up to about 20%. But if we reach 4 degrees...
Indicating an increase of hunger.
An increase of hunger. And at the same time, if we reach 4 degrees, the areas where this food is being grown today will become unviable. And if it becomes unviable, then definitely in a continent where you have 240 million citizens going to bed hungry. And at the same time, this number is predicted to increase under the changing climate. So if nothing is being done, then the economic gains that the continent have made will not only reduce, but at the same time will plunge millions of people into situations that could not be rosy for the continent.
Surely situations which will not be rosy. Which are some of those African countries which are exposed clearly by this climate issue?
No country is immune to climate change.
But there are some which are clearly exposed. I believe that some island states may disappear completely.
That's what the science is telling us, but I think we don't want to go there in terms of trying to think if a country or an island state should disappear. And that is why the measures, as you mentioned upfront, have to be put in place. Measures like building capacity, measures like ensuring that infrastructure is put in place, but infrastructure that mainstream climate change into all aspects, into aspects of development, into decision-making framework, putting policies in place. Like, for example, we carry out a project in Seychelles, whereby we through a project called Climate Change and Development for Africa, in collaboration with the United Nations Development Programme. What the UN Environment Programme and the United Development Programme did was to ensure that climate change, being an issue that is affecting every citizen across the continent and the world today, needs to be mainstream and put in the development vision of every country. Therefore, it has to become part and parcel of the education curriculum. But what was done in Seychelles was you have to lead by doing, and showing that if you can integrate climate change into development processes, in this case rainwater harvesting in school, where actually water was being harvested and utilized in gardening, and at the same time also for drinking, help in reducing the water bills in the school by $250 every month. And then the government of Seychelles legislated a bill into law by integrating rainwater harvesting into every building code in the entire country. So by an action, climate change action, it was actually being put into a decision, and in this case, a policy that is applicable in the entire country. And overarchingly, what needs to be done is climate change also presents an opportunity, an economic opportunity from the perspective of ensuring that we can be able to utilize what we call an ecosystem-based adaptation approach.
What does that mean?
What this means is working with our ecosystem, ensuring that our forests, our waters, our seas can be able to be better managed in such a way that they're not only providing services like providing water for agriculture, ensuring that our soils are actually renourished in such a way that we are not degrading it, because currently, as we speak today, the African continent is losing $65 billion US as a result of degraded soil. Okay. And this is currently affecting the 240 million citizens who go to bed hungry, meaning that the soils are not performing at its best because they are not being managed in such a way that they can be able to produce at optimal levels. Okay. And if we don't better manage our soils in such a way that they can be able to produce the food, then we'll be getting towards a situation where, as a continent, where we have 65% of uncultivated arable land, and at the same time, every year, the continent spends $35 billion US in importing food. Whereas it could still grow this food within the continent, then the opportunities of ensuring that we can be able to feed the population will be lost. And this could plunge the continent into a situation that is catastrophic.
And how does this redefine the roadmap of emerging economies in Africa? Here we are talking about climate change and development of Africa's emerging economies. Cameroon will tell you of 2035, Nigeria will tell you of 2020, Gabon will tell you of 2025, Kenya, where you come from, will tell you of 2030.
Excellent question. And I take you back to what I said before, Africa rising cliche. Excellent. The Africa Economic Outlook Report shows that the economic growth of the continent in 2014.
That is a report done by the
African Development Bank
and
the United Nations Economic Commission
for Africa.
In 2014, the African economic growth was at 5.2. The predictions for 2015 is the economic growth will be 5.5. But the broader question is, on the one hand, the economic growth is rosy. On the other hand, the poverty levels have not shifted. So what does this growth mean for the African continent today? It means that there are two phases of Africa. The rosy phase where the economic growth are rising, and this phase where you have 410 million Africans trapped in poverty, higher than the 290 in 1992. So the numbers have pretty much doubled. So what we need to do, we need to look at 4 critical issues to be able to ensure that the growth is inclusive. The growth takes everyone forward. And the first part is the youth voyage. As we speak today, the continent of Africa have 200 million youthful population between the ages of 14 and 25 years. This number is predicted to increase to about 400 million in less than 15 years from today. And if nothing is being done, though this is being charted as the youth dividend, of course it is a dividend, it's an opportunity. But I say Africa has a peaceful space. What I mean by that is we can be able to tap into this potential for the good of the continent, for enhancing the economic growth, and at the same time also building what I also call structural transformation, where we are not only creating jobs for a few, but creating jobs for the millions who are the youthful population. The second is African infrastructure have got to be revamped. When I talk of infrastructure, I'm also talking of ICT, which is the internet, in this case, whereby it is being utilized in so many countries across the globe. And if I take Kenya, for example, where ICT has actually advanced to a very high level, and other countries like Nigeria, like South Africa, and etc., they are utilizing this not only for ensuring a bigger market for their produce, but at the same time also engaging the youth in public policy debates. The other part is, under infrastructure, is Africa produces a lot, but most of the food that it produces actually gets spoiled. Industrialization. And we need to transform. Absolutely. And I think that is a serious issue where the continent have got to look at. Africa consumes what it doesn't produce, and it produces what it doesn't consume. If you look at the import bill on food products, As I said earlier, the continent is spending 35 billion US dollars a year in importing food. But the continent produces food and export without actually processing it, and that is why the
without added value.
Without added value. And I call that industrial productivity. The continent has got to ensure that it produces, it processes, and then it exports. So the value addition in the process can be able to create jobs in transportation, in processing, in packaging. So and these jobs could actually absorb the 10 million youths who gets into the workforce every year.
We need to redraft our budget priorities, because when you look at most budgets of many African governments, the consumption part of it supersedes the investment part. So there should be massive investments.
Absolutely. And that investment have to go into the agricultural sector. The World Bank report shows that the agricultural sector is the only sector that can reduce poverty levels by 11 times more than any other sector. And how this can happen is if investment is targeted towards agriculture, it's not only going to produce the food that will feed the 240 million who go to bed hungry, but it's going to create jobs that will absorb the over 25% of youths who are coming out of school and they don't have jobs. And this is not necessarily just in the production part, but it is in the processing, it is in the packaging. And most of all, Africa needs an education revolution. Why I say this is premised on two things. First of all, the educational structure in the continent is just as good as it can be. It is not actually a means to an end. Sometimes it's like an end to a means. And what I mean by this is that the classic structure of primary, secondary, high school, university, you get a degree, master's, and a PhD, somehow has got to be revisited. Vocational education needs to become a priority, where it is re-engineered to ensure that as we are putting up the infrastructure, we are also producing the engineers who are going to repair the roads.
What you mean to say is that we need a kind of an educational system like that in Japan, where if you have to work with Toyota, you start learning how to build a car from, let's say, primary 3.
Absolutely. And I am not in any way trying to say that the current education should be thrown away completely.
Sure.
But what I'm saying, it should be re-engineered, redesigned in such a way that we can be able to start producing entrepreneurs with entrepreneurial skills, who can be able to create jobs, who can be able to build on what we already have, to repair our roads.
Okay. How should African governments, especially those from the Congo Basin, with the second largest sustainable forest ecosystem in the world, should negotiate at Paris to have a deal alongside Brazil?
Good question. Leadership starts with everyone. With a kid in primary school, with a kid in high school, with you and me. And leadership needs to be responsible in terms of how we can be able to demand what not only benefits you, but benefits everyone. What I mean by this is, it is not only up to the leaders to be able to ensure that the world can foster a legally binding agreement that takes into consideration the common but differentiated responsibilities, which is actually enshrined in the convention charter, the Climate Change Convention Charter. And what I mean is the citizens of Africa who are already bearing the brunt of the changing climate, hunger because of agricultural produce that are not up to or are being reduced, disasters like the drought that hit the Horn of Africa in 2011, and the Sahel in 2012.
Nobody wants Ethiopia 1986 again.
Absolutely. We shouldn't, because we have the power in our means, the ability to be able to prevent such disasters from happening. And what we need to do is that the citizens have got to demand from themselves first, what can I do to be able to make a change wherever I am? As a journalist, Charles, you can be able to make a change by educating the country and the continent by bringing to the fore what climate change actually means and how the communities can be able to change it. In my capacity as the African Climate Change Coordinator of the United Nations Environment Programme, I can be able to help advise based on the best scientific available information, and at the same time, how that can help in infiltrating into policy processes and decision-making frameworks. As citizens in the continent, they can be able to undertake activities within their means in terms of demanding and also creating space for policy dialogue and to influence public policy.
You are talking about policy dialogue. I asked you this question about 2 years ago when you were first guest on this program, and I go back to it. It is good, so many NGOs created, Forests for Life, whatsoever, WWF, Friends of Nature, Greenpeace. You have to keep the environment green, don't cut the forest, don't destroy this. But I asked the question I asked about 2 years ago. How do you tell your old mother in Ginicom not to destroy the forest, whereas she needs to produce food without having any assistance from the so-called NGOs campaigning for the environment?
My mother in Bello, and I actually have two mothers. I call them, there's one biological in Bello, and then there's one chemical in Bamenda.
Absolutely.
Yeah. First of all, the way we were brought up, we never lack food. And our mothers, just like your mother and mothers of so many Africans, use what we call indigenous techniques to be able to produce the food without applying chemical fertilizers, but using organic manure and using cultivation techniques that were helping enrich the soil. Whereas those techniques today seems to be disappearing. And if I take the case of Burkina Faso, for example, which I think those techniques are also being applied in Cameroon, Burkina Faso utilizes a technique called ZAI, Z-A-I. What that means is that they dig small holes in their farms and intersperse them with organic manure. Because this is in the Sahel, and then the dry seasons are longer than the rainy season. So when it rains,
sure,
somehow it is sporadic and then erratic.
And leads to floods.
And leads to floods. But these holes help to capture the rainwater and stores the rainwater and rejuvenate the water retention ability of the soil, therefore helping to ensure that the crops that, the seeds they've planted can be able to germinate. And what research recently has shown us is that yields as a result of using this indigenous technique did not only increase, but resulted in about 500% increase. 500% increase. What this means is, in as much as we have modern techniques, we should never lose sight of combining them with indigenous techniques that have helped feed Africa before and could potentially feed Africa today and tomorrow, and at the end of the day, also make Africa a breadbasket, not only for Africa, but for the entire world.
Sure. Before we conclude, there are so many agencies involved at the level of the United Nations in this environmental sustainable debate. You have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you have the United Nations Environment Program where you work. Part of the work is left with the United Nations Development Program. There is even the UN Environment Commission. Who does what, where, and how to have a synchronized report for a well-coordinated action?
Excellent question. As I indicated before, everyone needs to be on board, but as you know, the United Nations Environment Program is the voice of the environment within the entire UN system. And the main vision and mandate of the UN Environment Program is to ensure that environment is part of development, but development is led by the United Nations Development Program. But climate change, being a respecter of no barriers or boundaries, means that everyone has to come on board. All the UN agencies are working together because climate change, as I indicated earlier, also presents an opportunity to tap into alternative energy sources like renewable, sun, solar,
wind,
geothermal, wind, which could, as a result, provide energy to the 600 million impoverished Africans who don't have energy assets. At the same time, when you look at climate change as an opportunity and as a development issue, then UNDP has to be on board. When you're talking about putting climate change in the vision of countries' development and mainstreaming this into educational system, UNESCO has to come on board, UNICEF has to come on board. All UN agencies, FAO, World Food Program, all these, as a result of the food issues, the water issues, all these coming together means that everyone has to be on board. The NGOs for advocacy, we need to be on board. The media has its communication and making sure that you are not only creating awareness, but at the same time also helping influence policy through information, through educating. So everyone has to be on board. But I think before we end, I would like to say 4 things. The continent of Africa today is at the crossroads, but the space has got to be filled. And as I indicated earlier, I call it a peaceful space. Why? The continent have a youthful population. 200 million today, increasing to 400 million.
That's the first thing.
In less than 15 years from today.
Okay.
The youthful population have got a lot of potential, energy, dynamism, and time. The African Union has a master plan called Agenda 2063.
That is the second point. You spoke of 4.
Yes.
Because my producer tells me that we are running out of time.
Excellent. Okay. And within the Agenda 2063, it's titled Africa We Want. Africa where everyone will have access to health, and Africa where there will be 0 child going to bed hungry. And as a result of all these, the continent is losing.
It looks like the post-2015 agenda, the future we want.
The future we want. But the future we want can only be achieved when Africa can also start to generate internal revenue, to be able to fund that agenda, to fund programs that can be able to ensure that every child doesn't go to bed hungry, and at the same time address climate change
and reduce external debts.
And reduce external debt. The continent loses 50 billion every year as a result of illicit financial flows, on illegal, unreported, unregulated fisheries on the shores.
The third
is Africa's infrastructure and trade. Africa continent is the only continent on earth where inter and intra-trade is at 12%. In the United States, Canada, it's about 65%. In Asia, it's at about 55%. Within the African continent, intra-trade is only at 12%.
Too dangerous.
Too dangerous, because we're also losing opportunity.
The fourth?
The fourth is urbanization. Africa is the only continent in the world that is urbanizing at 3.5%. And the urbanization rate is not matching with the prosperity. What I mean by this is that in as much as you have so many citizens flocking into cities, that is not matched by the number of jobs that are created to be able to absorb these citizens who come to cities. So it will be good for the continent to be able to create opportunities in rural settings so that citizens can be able to create jobs for themselves and at the same time have opportunities, so migration to urban city is not really an option anymore because
will not constitute a crisis situation.
Absolutely.
Dr. Richard Munang from the United Nations Environment Program with headquarters in Nairobi, Kenya. Thanks very much for accepting to be guest on Globe Watch.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.